Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ed Meyer, and I'm the founder and managing director of Meyer Strategies. I serve as a senior advisor with Business Forward, and I'm partnering with them on these convention policy roundtables. During the Obama administration, I served at the State Department, and 4 years ago in the last election cycle, I led Hillary Clinton's policy outreach work. And I'm super excited to be moderating many of these panels, including this one today on protecting the integrity of the election. We have some great panelists with us today, but first I'm going to kick it over to the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, Garland Gilchrist. He serves as the vice chair of the convention, and he's going to start out with some welcome remarks and really welcome us and to help kick off these policy roundtables. So over to you, Lieutenant Governor.
Ed, thank you so much for your leadership and participation in this convention this year, this historic convention that's unlike anyone we've ever had. I also want to thank all of the other panelists in this particular policy roundtable about election security, which is frankly just a bedrock conversation that we need to have about the nuts and bolts about how we are going to make sure that people have the right to actually exercise their franchise here in November and frankly going forward in elections beyond 2020. I'm proud to be here with you as Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Michigan. It is an honor to be a public servant that was voted in by the people. But I want to talk a little bit just for a moment about why this matters so much to me. You see, I got into public life because I ran to be an election administrator in the city of Detroit where I live. When Donald Trump won Michigan in 2016 by the slimmest margin he won any state, he won it by 10,704 votes. And I got into politics because I felt like there were 11,000 votes in Detroit if we had an election that worked for people. But unfortunately in 2016, we saw some election administration failures that led to a failed recount and frankly, some of the failed possibilities of what it would mean for people to actually have political power. I saw what it meant on a very local level to have an election breakdown and have it be nationally significant. So now as we move forward, and we see all of the challenges that we face when it comes to elections, misinformation and disinformation, interference from abroad, malfeasance at the local level, frankly, policies that are working to count voters out rather than count voters in a structural, systemic, and many times racist way. We have an opportunity to talk about a vision for what it means for everyone to have access to the ballot box that is safe and that is equitable, and that allows them to recognize and practice their real rights. That's what this party is all about. We want people to participate in the political process. We want their voices. We want their energy. We want their votes, and we want their power. We are the party that isn't afraid of people voting. And any party that is afraid of people voting, you have to question their motives. So this conversation that has all these experts from every angle about how to deal with elections and their security from a technical perspective, from a rhetorical perspective, from a policy perspective, are creating the conditions for America to truly live up to its promise and for every American to be able to act on that promise that was given to them with their right to vote. This is really important to me personally, but it's important to our nation and our world for America to continue to be the beacon of democracy as the longest constitutional democracy that's living, that we have an opportunity to demonstrate what that really looks like and how we can do it better. So I am so thankful for the invitation and opportunity to kick off this conversation. I know that everyone participating is going to learn a tremendous amount. And most importantly, we will leave it equipped for what we need to do on the ground to make sure everyone can vote safely. In an era where the post office is under attack, we have an opportunity to show what it means to vote safely and what it means to make sure that people are not denied anything but their power here in 2020. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Thank you so much for being supporters of the party, of elections, of Joe Biden, of Kamala Harris, who want more people to vote than have ever voted before. Y'all stand tall for democracy by standing tall for election security.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. We're very grateful for your time this morning and so happy you could join us. And I'm excited now to dive into our amazing panel that we have assembled. We have Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of the great city of Chicago. We have Emily Kane with us, the executive director at Emily's List. Alex Morgan, the executive director of the Progressive Turnout Project. And Rashna Desai-Martin, who is the national director of voter protection with the Biden-Harris campaign. I'm super excited to have all of you with us today. Just a quick introductory note to people that are following us online. If you would like to participate in this discussion and want to send us a question for one of our panelists, please email us at info@businessfwd.org. That's info@businessfwd.org. And I will read aloud some of those questions with our panelists today. I'd also like to thank our host committee sponsor, the Progressive Turnout Project, and our panelists for making today's discussion possible. So before we dive into the general discussion part, I'm going to kick it around to each of our panelists and ask them to give a little bit of a background on themselves and their organizations or their city and the mayor's perspective, and how they plan to protect this year's election. So first of all, I'm going to kick it over to Mayor Lightfoot for her opening thoughts. Mayor?
Thank you very much, Ed, and thanks so much for Business Forward and everybody for organizing, I think, this incredibly important conversation. Every day, the importance of this fall's election grows and grows. And every day, unfortunately, we see increasing evidence that this administration is mounting a full-out assault on every pillar of our democracy, including the integrity of our elections. This is real, folks. It's not an exaggeration. It's not a conspiracy theory. We're gathered here to make sure that we convey to the American people just what is at stake and how vital it is to protect the vote, to get out the vote, and to count every vote. In normal time, we would be preaching the gospel of turnout. But this year, it's not just about turnout. All the traditional and predicted means of voting are under attack. Because of the failure of this administration to keep Americans safe from COVID-19, we are wisely encouraging people to vote by mail. What we don't need, unfortunately, is a repeat of what we saw in primary after primary, where people literally risk their health just to cast a vote. Vote by mail is the lane that we need to run in. And that's why we cannot allow this administration to undermine the Postal Service in a way that it's clearly trying to drive the Postal Service to its knees. Making mail service unreliable, putting postal workers at risk by changing hours and stretching into the night, and failing to give the post office the resources that it needs to fulfill its basic mission. This assault, of course, is about election integrity, but truly it's about so much more, because people depend upon the mail for essential services like medicine and banking, of course, other forms of commerce. So what we need to do in the face of this pandemic is to make sure that Americans understand that it is safe to vote, not dangerous, that the integrity of our elections is the highest priority. Now, they are drumming up a climate of anxiety, and it's driven by their desperation to hold on to power. You can see the Senate majority eroding, and the Oval Office is slipping from their grasp. Their current efforts reflect their desperation and their fear. To them, this means defunding the post office. This means closing polling places in neighborhoods, wantonly purging voter rolls, and reimposing thinly disguised poll taxes, disenfranchising voters who have been released from incarceration. Unfortunately, the list goes on and on. So what must we do? We need to make sure that we learn the lessons of history, that we make sure that we stand up in this moment and call it like we see it, and keep encouraging people to stand up and claim their right as Americans to vote. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that we protect the post office. We need to make sure that people understand that voting by mail, their votes will be encountered. We need to make sure that at the local level, we're doing everything we can to have polling places open, to make sure that we've got election judges, poll watchers, and that we get every vote counted as quickly as possible once the polls close. As Democrats, we must be united in preserving the core pillars of our democracy. United, we win. Divided, we will be empowering the enemies of democracy to prevail. This election is about the soul of our democracy today and in the future, nothing less. So we must set the example and rally millions of decent Americans from every political stripe to make sure that the election happens, that people are able to vote and cast their ballots, and that there's no question regarding the integrity. That is our mission, accepted willingly, and we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Thank you so much, Mayor Lightfoot. Thank you for joining us today. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Emily Kane. Emily is the executive director at Emily's List. Emily, could you tell us a little bit about how are Emily's List candidates campaigning during the pandemic? How are you preparing them to get out the vote? And what does a ground game even look like in 2020?
Well, thank you so much, Ed. And, as the mayor said, this is such an important conversation. And, I was thinking about it when I got asked a couple of weeks ago by Jim Doyle to do this panel. I thought that's a good topic. And then in the last 2 weeks, it seems like every single day, the stakes have gotten higher and higher as we see such dangerous rhetoric coming from the president, as the mayor stated, putting anxiety out there for voters that we have to do something about it. For us at Emily's List, we've been working to elect pro-choice Democratic women for the past 35 years. Whether that's in state houses or in City Hall, the halls of Congress, governor's mansions, and offices like Secretary of State and Attorneys General. Of course, we care about the integrity of voting in this election and all elections. I think it's important to say up front that this is not just one organization's issue for November, that we are working from the candidate side and the campaign side, from the presidential all the way down to state and local races. But we're also working with other C3 and C4 organizations that are a little less political, like Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, the Brennan Center, Democracy Docket, the Lawyers Project, Voto Latino, Progressive Turnout Project, and more. No one is taking this November for granted. We are fighting, and we are doing it together. At Emily's List, our focus has to be on voting, because we believe who sits at the table of power makes all the difference. And our women are making the difference right now. You just heard from Mayor Lori Lightfoot, leading in Chicago, one of many talented women mayors across the country who already have so much on their plates in this very scary year with the pandemic. They are still leading right now because they know what's at stake in November. And look at the US Senate, where you see Senator Amy Klobuchar leading the fight for funding for voting. You see Nancy Pelosi and her amazing group of diverse women that Emily's List helped to elect in 2018, heading back into Washington, springing into action here in August to stand up for the post office. We see governors like Michelle Lujan Grisham and Gretchen Whitmer, who are already showing such leadership on COVID-19, who are also gearing up to make sure their states can vote safely and securely this fall. And secretaries of state like Nellie Gorbea in Rhode Island, who just this summer worked on eliminating witness and notary requirements for absentee balloting. Attorneys General like Maura Healey in Massachusetts, organizing across the country to take legal action as the president continues his false and awful attacks on the post office. And at the state legislative level is really where I want to focus. At the state legislative level is where we see some of the most crucial action. And I'll give you an example. Consider Virginia. In 2015, Virginia Democrats were in the minority in both chambers. In 2017, as one of the first beacons of light post-2016 election, we saw Democrats come back to flip 15 seats, 11 of which were Emily's List women. In 2019, we didn't stop. We flipped both chambers there, and one of the first bills they passed when they got the majority was no excuse absentee voting. At Emily's List, we provide strategic, real-time support and advice for women running for office. Earlier this year, all of us had to pivot quickly because of the pandemic to change our approach, not only to where we work, as I come to you from my house in Orono, Maine, but how we do our work so we can connect. So we worked immediately to get our campaigns transitioned to going online, amplifying their work, and doing virtual voter connections. And now we're doing that with getting out the vote. We're seeing campaigns amp up virtual volunteers using platforms like Zoom, phone calls, town halls. We're seeing them also use the mail. How important is that, right? That's going to be a theme, I think, of this whole conversation. We're seeing them use text more aggressively and really going the extra distance, not just to get the voters in a position and persuade them, but educate them about what's happening. And that's really the difference. I think that's what we've seen throughout 2020, because we saw many of our campaigns as in the spring, as they were stepping up with their pre-primary efforts, they were also stepping up COVID relief efforts, trying to be a resource and provide good information for people about what was happening where they live. And we see them doing that now with voting. They're not just focused on persuasion, they're focusing on how do we get out the vote and do it safely. So for us at Emily's List, we see there's a lot at stake this fall. We've had a project going for 5 years called Focus 2020. That's been all about getting ready for redistricting. So we know what's on the line this fall. We have to hold and flip key state legislative chambers. We have to flip the Senate. We have to hold the House. We have to flip the presidency. It's an all of the above type election, and voting is key to that. And so we're excited to be in this conversation and empowering our women candidates across the country to be a part of the solution. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. And we'll look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A period, along with the mayor. But next, we're going to turn over to Alex Morgan. Alex leads the Progressive Turnout Project. Alex, tell us a little bit about your organization, what your mission is, and what are you doing this year in 2020 to protect the integrity of this election?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ed, and my fellow panelists and the convention staff for bringing us together today as we kick off another exciting convention. I'm honored to be here representing staff across 17 battleground states this year. Our team is working hard to call and connect with voters to make their plan to vote this year. And I'm also grateful to our hundreds of thousands of small dollar donors and supporters across the country who make all that work possible. We're here this week so we can build back better with Vice President Biden and Senator Harris. We know that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are best suited to take on the major crises facing us as a nation. That's COVID-19, the crippled economy, and the racial injustice that plagues all of our communities. Today, we need to focus on another crisis, and that's why I'm excited to be part of this panel, the ongoing assault on the right to vote. We have to work to not only get out the vote over the next 78 days, but once Joe Biden and a Democratic Congress are sworn in next January, we have to work to enact much needed voting and voting rights reforms into law. Voting rights have to be a bread and butter issue for Democrats. One person, one vote is a cornerstone of our democracy. And we have to act with urgency and cement that principle into our federal law with a new voting Bill of Rights. We have to do this to ensure that people who are often shut out of our democracy, people of color, young people, and poor and working people, are able to take part in our democracy on a level playing field. We can't truly serve voters if we're not making every effort to listen to their voices through the ballot box. Now, while we know our voters can benefit from expanded access, this truly isn't a partisan issue. Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike can benefit from increased voter turnout by running on ideas and policies that are most popular among the majority of voters. When more people vote, our elected officials better represent America. Yet, Republicans have spent decades making voting more and more difficult, so voters give up and stay home. They've enacted limits on early voting and vote by mail, put in place voter ID laws as a modern-day poll tax, and placed onerous barriers and restrictions on ex-felons who have served their sentences. We see voter suppression tactics like these at higher rates in majority-minority communities and college towns to keep people of color and young people out of the political process. And through gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics, Republicans have manipulated our electoral process to ensure they win even when they receive fewer votes. Unfortunately, Democrats have not always risen to the challenge. In the past, we haven't made the case for the importance of voting rights and voter turnout. We've proposed legislation that tinkers on the margins or hopes that Republicans will go along with reauthorizing legislative wins from generations ago. But the COVID-19 outbreak has shown us that we need a bold rethinking of how we engage in our political process in this country. That's why when a new Congress convenes, they must introduce and pass a voting Bill of Rights, including the reforms that many of our candidates we supported in 2018 co-sponsored and led on, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, both of which have the support of Vice President Biden and were co-sponsored by Senator Harris. President Biden has to make these critical reforms a priority in his first 100 days, including the restoration and expansion of the Voting Rights Act, which was decimated by John Roberts in the Supreme Court. We've got to enact automatic and universal voter registration for Americans when they turn 18. We have to fully fund universal vote by mail and ensure every voter is mailed a postage-paid ballot. We've got to require election officials in every state to accept ballots that are postmarked by election day. We've got to mandate early voting periods. And we have to increase the pay and training for poll workers and require their employers to allow them the day off like we do when someone's called for jury duty. And we have to put an end to felony disenfranchisement, voter ID laws, and mass purges of the voter rolls. And finally, we've got to allow territories like DC to finally achieve statehood. When President Biden signs these reforms into law, then we are going to finally have equal opportunity for all Americans to participate in the political process. We'll be able to live up to our democratic ideals, and we'll have set the foundation to tackle the big issues that create disparate health and economic outcomes across the country. But if we're going to have a President Biden and Vice President Harris who can achieve these goals, then we have a lot of work to do. We have to spend the next 78 days until Election Day focused on one-on-one conversations with voters about their plan to vote, with a specific focus on early vote and vote by mail. And we've got to expose and hold accountable Republicans at the federal, state, and local level who refuse to expand vote by mail and adequately fund our elections. And this includes holding congressional hearings into illegal attempts by Donald Trump and his administration to dismantle the United States Postal Service. At Progressive Turnout Project, we recognize that many voters may not know how to vote time to allow for the process. And that's why we're working to call more than 20 million inconsistent Democratic voters between now and Election Day to encourage them to request and complete a mail-in ballot. And we're sending personalized letters to anyone who we don't have a phone number for so that they can get the exact same message and cast their vote by November 3rd.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I just want to remind everybody watching at home online that if you have a question, you can email us at info@businessfwd.org. We've had many questions come in, but please keep those coming, and we're reviewing them, and we'll ask our panelists. And it's now time to get to our final panelist before we get to our Q&A session. And I have to tell you, as in my hometown of Dallas, where I live, is I'm out walking my dog or doing yard work in the front. Whenever I see a friend that knows I'm involved in politics, the number one question they ask me is, what is the campaign doing to protect our vote and make sure that we've got every vote's going to count? And I respond to them that they've hired an amazing National Director of Voter Protection, and that's Rachna Desai Martin. So we're very fortunate to have Rachna with us here today, and I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ed. No pressure. We're ready to go. I'm very excited to be here talking with you all today. The Biden-Harris campaign is tremendously focused on election integrity. We're taking it really seriously. It's not just my department in the campaign that's working on this. This is voter protection work is integrated into every element of the campaign. It's imbued into the campaign's core messaging, our engagement strategies, our organizing strategies. We're doing everything we can to make sure that voting this year is smooth, safe, and a secure process. America's had a long and fraught voting rights history, and that battle, especially of late, has been an uphill one. Many of the problems that we've seen recently, long lines, confusion, insufficient poll worker training, delayed mail ballots, these have unfortunately been a part of voting in this country for a long time. And these problems are exacerbated by the pandemic and by Donald Trump and his party's campaign of voter suppression. I want to start with actually a top line point, which is we need to be very clear when we're talking to voters that they have many options to vote. They can do it by mail, they can do it in person. The key is that they do it early. And our programs are really focused on getting at exactly this point. So since voting laws vary from state to state, we're building a state-based hyper-local voter protection operation that focuses on three key areas. First is increasing voting options. We're doing everything we can to make sure that voters have access to multiple safe options, as I mentioned, by mail and in person, during early vote, and on Election Day. It's particularly important in a time of pandemic that voters can choose what method works best for them. Vote by mail is a very good option for many, many, many people, but it is not an option that works for everyone. There are communities of color who have a long and strong history of voting in person. Some in the disability community or who don't speak English as a first language have a harder time accessing vote by mail. And so for this reason, we also want to make sure that election administrators are making sure that there are plentiful in-person voting opportunities. And we truly believe that increasing the days, the hours, and the availability of early vote locations will make in-person voting safer because it spreads out the amount of time that people can choose to vote. The second very important area we're focusing on is expanding voter registration. We're looking for any and all opportunities to make voter registration easier through offering online voter registration, smoothing the online process where it already exists. We're monitoring voting rolls for voters who have been wrongfully purged or who have been moved to inactive status, just to make sure that everyone is ready to go. And so some of these states that are doing these proactive mailings of vote by mail applications, or even in some cases ballots, if you're not registered to vote at your current address, you're not going to receive those mailings. So it's critically important that we do that voter outreach now and we make sure that everyone's voter reg is updated. The third prong of our work is protecting voters. The best way to protect the vote is to educate voters on their rights. And to that end, we're providing reliable and updated information on platforms like iwillvote.com. And we're staffing voter assistance hotlines across the country, staffed by legal volunteers who are well-versed in the specific state's election laws. And we also have a national hotline that folks from any place in the country can call. We're helping people navigate the specific barriers they may face to voting so that everyone has an opportunity to cast their vote. We're also recruiting, training, and deploying poll observers to polling places across the country. They are our eyes and our ears. They identify issues to the greatest extent possible, resolve them right there on the ground in the moment so that everybody can keep voting. They also report issues back up to us so that we can better track and identify trends and take appropriate actions. The right to vote, it protects all of our other rights. It underlies our democracy. That's why it's so important for us to be out there doing this work every day. We need to be meeting voters where they are, be it online, at polling places, through their calls into the hotline, through our community engagement work. We need to be everywhere, informing voters about their options and helping them exercise their right to vote. This year, democracy is on the ballot. I hope you will join us in doing everything we can to protect the vote and to elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Democrats across the country. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Rachna. And now we're going to get to our question and answer period. And we've received hundreds of questions from around the country. And I must say that the vast majority of those questions are on the post office crisis. Clearly, that's what's on everyone's mind this morning across America. There's folks like Jackie Kilborn in Boulder, Colorado, Deidre Query from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Bob Bradley from Bloomington, Illinois, not too far from you, Mayor Lightfoot, all asking, just to name three, about what do we need to do to protect the postal service and make sure that we can get our mail-in ballots in. Maybe I'll start on this one with Emily Kane, and then we'll just kick it around for others that want to jump in. Emily?
Well, look, for me, at Emily's List, we are responsible for the women elected officials who are right now leading the way. And I think in a moment like this, we have to do everything we can to support, we heard this morning, Speaker Pelosi bringing the House back in next week. That's real. That is so she can take an action. They're not normally in next week, and the election is in fewer than 80 days. So what we need to do right now is support that work and then take whatever they pass and hold the Senate accountable. We know Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and Senator Patty Murray, we know that they're going to do the right thing. What we need to do is hold those Republicans accountable. But I will also say, from an election perspective, is while these members of Congress are doing that work in Washington next week to hold the president accountable, and most of all to support the hardworking men and women of the United States Postal Service, what we also need to do is continue to support their electoral efforts at home. So while they're working in Washington, if you can go volunteer for one of their campaigns remotely, you should do that. If you can send them an additional contribution, and yes, Emily's List stands for early money is like yeast, it makes the dough rise. So I can't help but make a plug for our candidates and their hardworking campaigns. but we can have their back in their campaigns while they are doing the work in Washington. And so there's a lot of things you can do. Get educated, share good information with your friends, and we can win this, and we can support the post office, but we have to support the elected officials who are doing this work.
Thank you, Emily. Who else would like to jump in on this question of the post office crisis? Mayor Lightfoot?
Yes, I think the other thing that we need to think about is obviously the pressure at the national level is important, but each of these postal areas is controlled by a local postmaster. So I think we don't forget that we need to put our foot on the gas at the local level as well. We need people to reach out to that local postmaster when they're seeing long lines just to get into a post office. When we see that mail delivery isn't happening or is greatly delayed. And we need to support our postal workers as well. They're being asked to do way more than normal with less resources, less people on the ground, and working in conditions that is just not safe. That's not right. That's not fair to them. So I think there are pressure points at the local level that we also need to step up on. That's what we're doing here in Chicago. And I encourage people across the country. You shouldn't stand for anything less than first-rate postal service, whether it's the delivery of the mail to your house, whether it's going into post offices and making sure that you get timely service where you don't have to queue up outside. And we need to make sure that we stand firm in support of our postal workers as well.
Thank you, Mayor.
Go
ahead, Rachna.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that is a very specific thing that individuals can do, which is, understand, and I feel like I talked about this so much, but I feel like you can never say this too many times, is really understand all of the options that you have to cast your ballot so that you can make the decisions that are best for you and your family and your friends and your community. So if you want to use vote by mail and you have concerns about the post office, many times you can actually request a vote by mail ballot through calling or from online. So there are other options there. You can return vote by mail ballots through drop boxes or taking them back to your county elections board or registrar. So the rules are very different state by state, but there are many options to engage in this process. And the best thing that you can do to protect your vote is to engage in that process really early.
I will
can
say
I jump
that,
in as
yeah,
well?
Please, Alex.
Just the last thing I want to say, Donald Trump loves to distract. And now we've got to fight on two fronts here, right? Because this is about protecting the post office, which is incredibly important. And we've highlighted some really great ways to do that. But this is coming in part because he knows we've been fighting for full election funding in the next stimulus package. He knows that we want to fully fund USPS to handle the capacity and make sure everyone who wants to vote by mail can vote by mail. So we can't lose sight of that battle as well and keep the pressure up on our members of Congress and the Republican Senate to make sure we still get those pieces in the next stimulus package.
And Ed, if I can just add one more piece to this.
Yes, Mayor.
And I want to pick up on the point that Alex made, which is 100% right. Donald Trump thrives in chaos. He likes creating this atmosphere of uncertainty, of danger. Is something right? Is it not right? What we need to do is make sure that we block out the noise and let people know that their vote is safe, that there's many ways in which they can do it, and that they're not going to be prevented from voting. That is one of the most important things, is to break through the noise and the chaos that this administration and his campaign are trying to create, that somehow their vote won't matter. Somehow they won't be able to vote. Not true. And we just got to make sure that we continue to focus on letting people know the many ways in which they can vote and why their vote matters.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'll say to Rachna's point about the many different ways of voting. In Dallas, I voted in the runoff, primary runoff in July. And I must say, we have early voting for 2 or 3 weeks prior to voting day. And I was the only one in there in Dallas County. It felt, which should be concerning for many other reasons, since I was the only one there. But it actually did feel safer than going to the grocery store. It was actually very well run. And so early vote is certainly a great way to vote maybe without crowds, but let's hope there are a lot of people voting early, and we are busy. I want to move to another question that I really like from Monica Tomasi in Oregon, Sisters, Oregon. And I'll just read the question. It is, on protecting the integrity of the election, are we preparing for the worst? What is in place right now to prevent widespread and varied acts of voter suppression between now and November 3rd. And what is missing from those plans? And who can we turn to fill those gaps? So this is sort of one of those, when you go to sleep at night and you have that knot in your stomach, what is keeping you up the most on this question of voter protection? And maybe I'll turn to Rachna on the campaign to start us out, and then we'll go around for everyone's thoughts.
Sure. I think that the thing, I guess this is my job. So my job keeps me up most at night. I'm worried about so many different things with respect to the election, but I'm a worrier. I think the key point to convey, though, is that I know that we as a campaign are doing the most that we can do to educate voters about what their rights are and how they can exercise their right to vote. This will be so important because there's just sitting here, I don't know what's the best way for any one of you all to vote, right? But you know your personal circumstances, and what we need to do is get that information out to voters so they can exercise their rights. In terms of what are we doing to protect the vote, I think the voter education component is a big piece of that. And another piece of that is that we are in states across the country. We are developing this network of lawyers, and they will be there. They will be at polling places. They will be monitoring what's going on. They will be letting us know where it's appropriate. They will be assisting voters. So that work is ongoing and in place. And, I think that everybody can engage in that. They can volunteer with us or a whole host of other organizations that are doing similar work. They can see something, say something, I guess, to use the bad phrase. But look, everybody should be really vigilant about their rights, and we all need to do work to protect them.
Mayor, I'll kick it over to you. I'm sure there's a lot that keeps you up at night as the mayor of a very large city like Chicago. But in terms of voting and protecting voters and making sure everyone can get out and vote, what sort of keeps you up at night the most on that issue?
Look, I think the thing that I worry most about is this chaos and uncertainty that's being created around whether or not mail-in voting is actually going to have integrity. I worry a lot about that because I think that's a horrible distraction, but it's an easy thing for people to fixate on. So what we're going to be doing between now and the election is, again, hammering home to people, elections are safe. Here's many ways in which you can do it. And our local election body is independent, but I'm going to be pushing them to think creatively about ways in which they can make the polling place actually accessible outside of the downtown. So, for example, in Chicago, we've got 80-something branch libraries all over the city, really our community gathering places. Can we put a locked box in those libraries so people can literally just drop off their mail-in ballot if they're concerned about whether or not it's going to get there? But I think we've got to use this as an opportunity to think creatively, but fundamentally we've got to push people to understand this is the most consequential election of our lifetime. It truly is. The soul of our democracy is on the line. Who we are going to be as a people is on the line. And we need people to feel comfortable voting. And really, for me, that's the most important thing between now and Election Day when the polls close.
Thank you, Mayor. Alex, how do you think about this question from the Progressive Turnout Project perspective?
This has kept me up at night because, the one silver lining over these past few months is we've spent more time with family, and I'm explaining all of my fears around this election. And so I think I'm reinforcing it quite a bit in my head. But the mayor and Rachna, hit on these points about combating disinformation from Donald Trump, from others, who are trying to undermine the election. I think the other side of that is all of us, anyone watching, all of our volunteers, all of our supporters. You are community validators who need to lift up this information and talk with your family, friends, and neighbors about how you're voting and the different ways that are available to vote in your communities. We've heard about how, we have a very decentralized system. It's different in every state and in a lot of different communities. So we need you to carry out the message about how that works. We've put together some tools at Progressive Turnout Project. One is votingmatters.org, where folks in key states can look up the rules and ways that they can go to vote. And then if you want to plug into our efforts, we have a turnout2020.org coalition effort where we're calling voters in key battleground states to keep them updated about what all their options are and encourage them to make a plan early, regardless of what mode they're going to use, to make sure they execute when the time is right, whether it's by mail, early voting, or on election day.
Thanks, Alex. And Emily, you probably get phone calls from worried candidates all across the country. What are they concerned about? What are you concerned about the most? I'm sure there's a lot of things, but on this issue, what's sort of most pressing?
Well, the question of what keeps you up at night is sometimes what worries you most and sometimes what it makes you most hopeful. So for me, what worries me most is along the same lines of what you've heard. It's the misinformation. I believe we will be giving out great information. I have a lot of faith in our candidates, in our campaigns, in the organizations I mentioned earlier that are doing this work together, taking both a legal approach, a sort of activist approach, an organizing approach, a grassroots approach, an education approach, all at the same time. What I worry about are the things that are harder to control. We've seen already, Emily's List has a lot of experience dealing with the way women candidates are treated, for example, whether it's by the media and sort of undermining their credibility, or in social media, where a lot of times we see the right-wing machine really trying to tear them down. I worry about those efforts to undermine the confidence people have in voting, which is why we can't take any days off when it comes to educating people about what is good, what is safe, and what is helpful. That you should be able to vote safely in person if you want to, but you also should be able to have confidence that when you put that ballot in the mail, it will get there. And I think we are doing everything right, but I worry about the things that are not in our control. But I'll also say what gives me hope, quite frankly, are the voters themselves. What we saw this year, we saw long lines in Kentucky and in Georgia, and we saw long lines in Wisconsin, but we saw long lines because the voters were not going to go home until they got to cast their ballot. And so the other thing that keeps me up at night is making sure we do right by those people. Women voters are so important. Emily's List, we've been spending a lot of time for many decades understanding women voters. Well, one thing is women voters are not all the same, but what I can tell you is women voters need us to have this safe vote by mail and vote in person, because they're often the ones, particularly who are single moms or who are working many jobs and wearing many hats, who need to have both flexibility and confidence because they're coming out to vote. In our battleground states in 2018, our battleground districts, we saw 54% of the turnout was women. If we can have 54% turnout this fall, we're going to win. And so we know the other side wants to stop us, but we know that women, and especially women of color, are the largest coalition and voting bloc in the country, and they have single-handedly powered the Democratic Party's gains throughout the Trump presidency. I know they're going to show up. It's our job to make sure when they do, whether it's by mail or in person, that they can vote safely and securely. So I'm glad we're all in for to make sure we can do that. But that's both what's giving me concern and what's giving me some hope.
Great, thank you, Emily. I'm going to read a question from Chelsea Hernandez in Austin, Texas. And she's asking, how do we ensure on the local level that elections are secure and being run properly? And we have a process for voters to report wrongdoings or concerns. So maybe if we could focus on this sort of, all these efforts that you all have been talking about to secure the election. But what's the best avenue if you are a concerned voter, concerned citizen leading up to election day about what's happening? What should people do? Maybe Alex, so maybe I'll turn it over to you to start, and then we'll go around the horn.
Sure. Well, we are so focused on one-on-one conversations, and I think the more information that voters have and the earlier they have it, the more likely they're able to successfully complete the process on November 3rd. So that's number one. If anyone watching lives in an area where they have Republican leadership that is doing whatever they can to thwart access to the ballot, we've got to call them out. And I said that earlier. We've got to call them out at the local, state, and federal level. Whether it's refusing to additionally fund the USPS, whether it is refusing to allow, no excuse absentee voting, whether it's an effort in a legislature to try and block a clerk who wants to send out absentee ballot applications. We've got to call that out. And again, I think it's so important for community validators, and that's anyone watching. conversations, with their friends, family, and neighbors. We found from our own experiments and the work that we do at Progressive Turnout Project that one-on-one conversations, our own conversations, increased turnout in the midterms among inconsistent Democratic voters by 10.4%. And we know that the more personalized the contact, the more effective it's going to be. So anyone watching who thinks that them spreading the word on their social media through text messages isn't going to have an impact, you're wrong. And you got to pick up the phone and you got to spread the word, and you have to help us get out the vote this year.
Thanks, Alex. Mayor, do you want to jump in on this one? This question around what individuals should do to report their concerns.
Well, I live in a city that is the deepest of deepest blue. So we don't have the kind of assaults on the integrity of the election process. But I do think one challenge that we're going to face, because this election is going to be unlike any other, where we're going to have more people vote by mail. That's early voting is going to start probably earlier than ever before. What does that look like? Because it's not just election day that matters. It's the process by which we get to election day, I think, that matters. I think one of the biggest concerns that I have is making sure that our local election authorities have the resources that they need to count the ballots and count them quickly. I think if we have a situation where it's days later and we still don't know what the election results are going to be, that's chaos, and that's chaos that plays into the hands of Donald Trump and other Republicans who want to are already trying to undermine the integrity of this election. So making sure that our local election authorities are resourced, that they have a plan in place, that they're going to work hard as soon as the polls close to start counting those ballots. That's going to be critically important. All the other things that Alex mentioned, that Emily mentioned, are absolutely important. But number one is making sure that the infrastructure is there to handle what I think is going to be a significant uptick in absentee ballots and voting by mail.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to hear from Rachna and Emily on this question, but I'm going to ask an added question that's come in that's related to this, but a little bit of a different perspective, and that is around social media. So Amina Ross is asking, what are the panelists doing to combat misinformation on social media, and what tools are you supplying at the grassroots level to report and refute misinformation? So maybe just sort of this broad question, but really specifically on social media, the misinformation that's out there. Rachna, I'll go to you, and then we'll kick it over to Emily.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, these are great questions. This is something that we saw a lot of this in 2016, and we certainly do not want a repeat of that. The campaign and the DNC have teams of people who are, specifically focused on disinformation and monitoring and, being active in that work. One way that I think individuals can be proactive is building on something that Alex has mentioned a couple of times, which is really being a good communicator on voting issues with your own networks and being a validator of true information. Because the way to combat disinformation is to flood the space with correct information. And this can be complicated because, the laws are different in different places. And so if you don't know the answer, don't guess. You can go, as I mentioned, you can go to iwillvote.com. There's information there. You can also call the National Voter Assistance Hotline. That's 833-336-8683, where their live operators will help answer any questions that you have about voting. And on voting days, if you're seeing something weird, like your polling place didn't open, that's the place to call. Call there, let us know so that we can circle back to the local election administrators and try to solve that problem for voters. So I think getting truthful information out into the space and helping us learn about what problems are out there are two really key things people can do.
Thanks. Emily, what's your perspective on this?
And I think it's actually building on what Rachna just said, is if you think about where we get our information and how we share information, it's really important to think first about where you live. I can't tell everyone who's listening and watching exactly what the rules are where they live. But whether you live in the big city like Chicago or a small town like I live in Orono, Maine, you can pick up the phone and call. You can find out. You can go online. You can be an arbiter of what is good information by going to the source. Call your elected official. Ask them. Look at who's campaigning in your area, your city councilors, your town councilors. They know the answer to these questions, or they can help you find them. And it builds on your question into your question about misinformation, because it does matter what you share. And sometimes when you see something that's false on the internet, the right thing to do is actually not to share it and put, this is false. That just shares it. And we know on social media that the more shares and likes and clicks you get, the more things go out into the ether. So what you can do is get educated at the local level. You know, I know where I live, I know my town clerk, and I know the people who work at the post office. And I've already talked with them about what's happening here. What are we doing about it? I'm excited to see that Maine is moving towards getting some of those drop boxes across our state. And I know other states are doing the same thing. So I would say one of the best things to do about misinformation is get good information for yourself and then share it with other people. And you've heard some great resources laid out here today about where you can get those facts that you can share. And I think that the power of that personal communication cannot be underestimated. And one thing I will also say, I think we also need to be thoughtful about adjusting our expectations about what it means to have election night this year. Because if we can make sure every vote gets cast safely and securely, that will include ballots being able to be postmarked by election day, which means those won't be able to be counted on election day. I think back to 2018, Emily's list flipped. We had flipped 23 seats, enough to flip the majority in the US House with pro-choice Democratic women, but we were waiting for one more, and it was Katie Porter in California. And on election night, they had said she wasn't gonna win. Same with Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. They said, nope, she's not gonna win. But those votes that had been mailed kept coming and kept getting counted. And both of those women are now exemplary public servants in the US Senate and the US House. So it's worth the wait. So let's get good information. Let's take a deep breath, do the work, and adjust our expectations to know we can win. But first order of business is making sure all of those votes get cast so they can be counted.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. We have time for really just one more question, and I'm going to go around once more to each of you, and we'll kind of go in the order that we kicked off. So we'll start with the mayor, and we'll end with Rachna. And this comes from David Marblestone in Maryland, and he identifies as a senior citizen. He says, "I'm a senior citizen. What can I do? What can other individuals do themselves over the next 2 months to protect the integrity of the election?" So we've talked about, we've hit on some of these points, and we've talked about, what people can do if they see wrongdoing or, if they see misinformation on social media. But think about, David, a senior citizen, like if he has time to put into helping protect the integrity of votes, what would you recommend he do for the next 2 months to help that effort? And I'll start with you, Mayor.
Well, I think that you've heard a lot of great advice. And David, thank you for the question. Number one is make sure you vote. Number two, make sure everyone in your network votes. Number three, if you really want to get interested in the ground level, look for opportunities locally to be a poll watcher. Now it's going to look very different than what it looks traditionally. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll pick up on a point that Rachna made earlier, which I think is really, really important, is be a validator for true information. Spread the word about where people can vote, how they can get access to the ballot. I think if we've got a groundswell of people who are willing to do that, this is going to turn things around with the misinformation campaign that's out there, sowing concern and fear about the integrity of our election process. We're all right to be concerned, and we're right to be lifting up this issue, but I think we can do a lot to calm people's nerves by making sure that we are validators of true information.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. Emily, over to you.
I would say to David that the first thing you can do is talk to your friends and make sure they know what they're doing when it comes to voting. It's amazing what a difference, especially as for us at Emily's List, we work with elections all across the country, many of which are often decided by a few dozen votes, right? They're decided at the very end, and they're decided by just a few votes. And in every single turn, that time that happens, we know there are people sitting at home going, oh, I meant to vote in that election. This is not one where we can afford to have people saying, oh, I wish that I had gotten out to vote, or I meant to do that. We have an opportunity to start today, start yesterday, start as soon as you possibly can. get that good information that we've talked about. You know, maybe find a candidate or 2 or 3 in your area that you care about, that you can help share with your friends, not just how to vote, but why you're doing it. And I think we have enough just at the top with the Biden-Harris ticket to get us going. But if you look up and down the ballot, whether it's for the Senate or the House, state and local offices, there are thousands of reasons across the country to vote. And if you find the one that means the most to you, tell your friends, and that will make all the difference.
Thanks, Emily. Alex, over to you.
First thing is make a plan, make it now. Like I said earlier, you can go to votingmatters.org. We've got lots of great information on there. The next step has been said, spread the word to your family, friends, and neighbors. You are a community validator. Your voice is really powerful. And then the last thing, if you want to help us get out the vote, make these 20 million phone calls to battleground states across the country, you can plug in with our team at turnout2020.org, and we would love to have you on board. But I think those are our 3 key steps to success this November.
Thanks, Alex. And Rachna, I think we're hearing some common themes, but what else would you like to add to close us out here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say, I reiterate everything that everyone said. These are the things that you can do. Number 1, vote. Number 2, educate other people with correct information. 3, help us get out the vote. You can go to joebiden.com to look for action items there. And 4, you can help us protect the vote by being a voter protection volunteer, going out to the polls, or virtually staffing some of our voter protection hotlines. So if you're a senior and you don't want to, you're not comfortable with in-person activity, that's a really amazing option and a way you can directly help voters. I think we're all on the same page. And I just want to say, Emily mentioned earlier, some of the things that keep her up at night are encouraging things. And I think being a part of this conversation was so encouraging, because I'm hearing Democrats, elected officials, and people who are helping elect more Democrats. We're all marching to the beat of the same drum. We're all working towards the same goal. And I'm really confident that we're going to win in November.
Thank you, Rachna. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to our panel sponsor, the Progressive Turnout Project. Alex, thank you. And thank you to the campaign for helping us pull together such a great policy roundtable. There's many more of these for all of you watching at home online. There are several of these every day, I think 10 in total between now and Thursday, or 11 in total, policy roundtables that we'll be conducting. And so please go to the convention website, look up those virtual policy roundtables, and tune into the ones that interest you the most, or tune into all of them. And we really thank you for joining us today. We thank again our panelists. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Monday and a great convention week. Thank you so much.